All right, good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us today for PPP Loan Mythbusters. I'm Jackie Petroselli, the marketing specialist at MP. For those of you joining us on a webinar for the first time, MP is a full-service human capital management services company. We provide a single solution and support for HR, payroll, benefits administration, time and attendance, and compliance. And today, instead of presenters, we will be introducing Mythbusters. So our first Mythbuster for today's presentation is Amanda Leonardi. She's an HR generalist at MP. She currently provides HR support to small, medium, and large-sized businesses in a variety of industries and previously managed HR for a 250-employee nonprofit organization. Amanda received her BA from Duquesne University in Pittsburgh and recently became a certified HR professional through SHRM. Our next Mythbuster is Sherry Heller. Sherry is a senior HR advisor here at MP. She provides HR support to businesses in a variety of industries. Sherry consults with business owners and managers at all levels of the organization to develop and implement their HR infrastructure. Sherry has over 20 years of experience in training and development, strategic planning, policy development, and employee relations, along with a master in education in instructional design from UMass Boston. And with that, I will hand the mic off to Sherry.
All right, I'm going to step in. Thank you, Jackie, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for another session of our weekly webinar series. Are you sick of hearing the term PPP yet? I don't know about you, but the letter P has officially become my least favorite letter in the alphabet. We are going to be busting some myths surrounding the PPP loans today, and I feel like I should be wearing a hat like Jamie from the show Mythbusters to really get into character here. But through the past few months, we have been hearing a lot of varying information or misinformation surrounding these loans. And this is totally understandable because we have really been left to our own devices throughout all of this. There's still so much information that has been left up to interpretation, but we wanted to address some of the questions and confusion that we've been seeing with this information that we know. So we'll get into it. Before we do, just a quick little disclaimer. This training is intended for educational and informational purposes only. We are not attorneys, and the information we discuss today should not be construed as legal advice. So first, we're going to get into some breaking news that is hot off the press with the PPP Flexibility Act. I am keeping my fingers crossed that President Trump waits until at least 2:01 p.m. this afternoon to sign this bill so that not all of the information in this presentation is going to be outdated during the next hour. After that, we are going to go through the top 9 PPP loan myths that we've been hearing. We're then going to answer your burning questions with a live Q&A, and then finish up with some helpful PPP loan resources for you. And then with that, I will kick it over to Sherry to fill you in on the latest and greatest breaking news.
Thanks, Amanda, and thank you everybody for being here this afternoon. So yes, hot off the press, late breaking news. So on the, excuse me, on the 28th of May, the House of Representatives passed Bill HR 7010, the Paycheck Protection Program Flexibility Act. They passed it actually overwhelmingly, 417 to 1, and then as of yesterday, it actually passed the Senate unanimously. Since this is hot off the press and we still have to wait for the president to sign the bill, I'll give you a quick overview now, but we'll be going into more detail during next week's webinar. So with the PPP Flexibility Act, forgiveness will be easier to come by and greatly increases the likelihood that a large percentage of a borrower's PPP loan will be forgiven. The bill includes an extension of the covered period from 8 weeks currently under the CARES Act to 24 weeks from the date of the loan origination or December 31st, 2020, whichever comes earlier. Borrowers who got their PPP loans prior to the date the bill is signed into law will have the option to continue with that 8-week covered period. You can spend more of the loan funds on non-payroll costs, with at least 60% of the loan going to payroll costs versus 75%, which was in the CARES Act. You'll also have longer to replace your FTEs and restore salaries, and they've changed the safe harbor dates from June 30th to December 31st, 2020. Businesses that remain partially or fully closed through the end of the year will also get some new relief. You'll no longer have to repay any loan proceeds that are not forgiven. I'm sorry, you'll have longer to repay. Excuse me, that was a Freudian slip, I think. You'll have longer to repay any loan proceeds that are not forgiven, going from 2 years to 5 years. And finally, borrowers will be able to defer the employer portion of Social Security taxes through the end of this year, even if your PPP loan has been forgiven. This gives employers until 2022 to repay those deferred taxes. So be sure to join Paul Corellis next Thursday at 1 p.m. for a deeper dive into the PPP Flexibility Act. All right, so on to our myths that we will be busting today. First myth is we can use the PPP funds to pay our independent contractors or 1099s. There's a lot of confusion on this. So this question number 15 is from the FAQ that was put out by the SBA. Should payments that an eligible borrower made to an independent contractor or sole prop be included in calculations for the borrower's payroll costs? And the answer was no. And the reason the answer was no is that those individuals are actually eligible to apply for their own PPP loan. And as you see on the screen here, this is the actual application that the SBA put out. And if you notice in there, there is no language in there regarding 1099s. Unfortunately, many of you, when you applied through your banks, the banks were allowed to create their own application process. And in doing so, many of them, I know my brother was a good example because as I helped him navigate this, his bank was asking for the payments to independent contractors. And they were using those numbers in order to determine the full amount of the loan. But that is not correct. So even though your bank may have asked you for that information, and even though they may have factored that into the total loan amount, you cannot use the PPP funds to pay independent contractors or 1099s. All right, Amanda, myth number 2.
All right, myth number 2, the PPP loan covered period begins when we're able to reopen for business. So this is not currently officially the case. However, as Sherry mentioned, we are expecting to hopefully get some good news, honestly, any minute now, which could very well change a whole lot of this information. But changes with the wind have been a common theme over the past few months, so I guess this is really nothing new. But as of now, the PPP forgiveness application, as well as the interim final rule on forgiveness, affirm that there are 2 acceptable ways to measure your 8-week window. The first is called the covered period, and this is an 8-week, 56-day period that begins on the same day as the day your loan was dispersed. So again, day number 1 of that 56-day period must be the same day as the PPP loan disbursement date. The second measurement option that the SBA offered is what's called the alternative payroll covered period. And this option was implemented for administrative convenience for employers with a weekly or biweekly payroll schedule. So under this measurement method, eligible employees may elect to calculate eligible payroll costs using the 8-week, 56-day period that begins on the first day of the first pay period following their PPP loan disbursement date. So the catch here is that you cannot switch it back and forth between the 2 measurement periods. If you do decide to use the alternative payroll covered period, you must apply this measurement method consistently throughout all applicable parts of the application. Now, when I say applicable parts, there are a few sections of the application where you cannot use the alternative payroll covered period, namely the eligible non-payroll costs. So just be sure as you're going through the application that you read the directions really carefully and only use the alternative payroll covered period when there is a designation throughout. So if we're going to look at the just regular covered period, if you go back 1 slide there, Sherry, we'll look at the difference between the 2. So this is the covered period. Remember that this is the 56-day window that begins on the day that the loan was dispersed. So you can see from this calendar that the loan was funded on Wednesday, April 15th, and that's our first day of the covered period. Our pay period runs weekly from Sunday to Saturday, and paydays are on Fridays. So you can see here that the covered period would end on June 9th. Now, take a look at the green boxes that you see on Fridays. Those are our paydays. We now know that both payments paid within the covered period and payments incurred during the covered period are forgivable. So what does that mean? The application states that payroll costs are considered paid on the day that the paychecks are dispersed or the borrower originates an ACH transaction. Payroll costs are considered to be incurred on the day that the employee's pay is earned. So in our example here, our first payday is, in this covered period, is April 17th. So even though the payroll is for hours that were worked April 5th through April 11th, which were outside of the covered period, those payroll costs are paid within the covered period and thus forgivable. Now, if we look at the payday on June 12th, you'll notice that this is outside of the covered period because the covered period ends on June 9th. But since the payroll that's being paid on the 12th is compensating hours worked during the pay period of May 31st through June 6th, those payroll costs were incurred during the covered period and are also forgivable. And then you'll see June 30th circled, and that's just a reminder right now that this is the last day to apply for a PPP loan, as well as the date in which you will need to get your FTE count and salary hourly wages back up to pre-pandemic levels in order for those safe harbors to be applied. If we go to the alternative payroll covered period now, so you see in the blue that the loan was funded on Wednesday, April 15th. However, that's the middle of a pay period. So in order to line up the 56-day window with the pay period, the alternative payroll cover period will start in line with the first day of the pay period following the disbursement of the loan. So in our previous example, the first payday in the covered period was April 17th. However, utilizing the alternative payroll cover period, the first payday in the window would be April 24th. We then count 56 days out to the end of our alternative payroll cover period, which ends on June 13th, in line with the last day of the pay period. Now, remember, since payroll costs incurred during the alternative payroll cover period are forgivable, the payroll on June 19th would also be eligible for forgiveness since the work was done during the pay period beginning June 7th and ending June 13th, which is in line with the end of the alternative payroll covered period. So you can see this method is really for administrative convenience. All right, myth number 3.
Okay, well, and as a reminder, this is only if you have a weekly or bi-weekly payroll. And we'll talk a little bit more about that coming up. So the covered period ends June 30th for all PPP loans. This has been a real stickler for a lot of people. They get very confused. And where does that all come from? And this is from the information sheet that the SBA put out when the PPP loan program went into effect. And as you can see, when it talks about what do I need to apply, it states here that your lenders will be processing your application by June 30th. And then again, when it says how long will the program last, it says that the program's open until June 30th. So that's where those dates have come from. And then in addition to that, we also have June 30th as the date that we need to bring our FTE and salary back up to pre-pandemic levels. And again, this is all changing, obviously, as we're in the middle of getting that new bill signed. So we're going with the 8-week period right now. Again, that will change to 24. But you see in this example, our loan was dispersed on the 27th of May, and our 56-day or 8-week period ends on July 21st, which is well after that June 30th date. So it's based on the time you have to spend the funds is based on when it was distributed. The June 30 date really is just that date that the PPP loans can be applied for. And currently, that's the date you have to bring your FTE count back up and your salaries. Again, that's going to change right now. All right, number 4.
Number 4, part-time employees are not included in the FTE count for loan forgiveness. So the FTE count has been a big point of confusion for a lot of people during this process. I've heard people say that part-time employees don't count toward the FTE. I've heard people say that all employees on payroll count as one FTE. I've heard people say that employees who work overtime count as multiple FTEs. So we didn't have a lot of clarification on the definition for a long time. So people were just taking kind of shots in the dark. But we know now that these statements are all myths. So with the loan forgiveness application, as well as the interim final rule, we received some clarification on that definition of an FTE and how to calculate it. And the SBA gave us 2 calculation options. So just to clarify, FTE stands for full-time equivalent employee, not full-time employee. And we now know that the definition of one full-time equivalent employee is someone who is paid for 40 or more hours per week. So if someone is paid for 40 hours per week, they count as one FTE. If someone is paid for 60 hours per week, they only count as one FTE as well. So that's pretty straightforward. It gets a little bit more tricky for your part-time folks. So for employees who were paid less than 40 hours per week, you may choose to calculate your FTE in one of 2 ways. The first is a calculation method, and this is where for each employee, you would enter the average number of hours paid per week, divide it by 40, and then round the total to the nearest 10th. The second method is a simplified method, and this is where you assign one FTE for employees who work 40 hours or more per week, and assign 0.5 FTE for employees who work fewer hours. You probably want to do your due diligence and test both options out, but just as a general rule of thumb, unless you have several employees that work 20 hours per week or less, you may be undershooting your true FTE count using that simplified method. So let's go through a couple of examples here. The first is the calculation method. So we have 4 employees working 40, 35, 30, and 20 hours per week. If we use the calculation method, you divide the average hours paid by 40 and round to the nearest 10th. So if someone works 40 hours, 40 divided by 40 is 1. If someone works 35 hours, 35 divided by 40 is 0.875. Rounded to the nearest 10th is 0.9. 30 divided by 40 is 0.75. Rounded to the nearest 10th is 0.8. And then 20 divided by 40 is 0.5. So if we add all of those together, our FTE total comes to 3.2 FTEs. And again, that's a calculation method. If we look at the alternative method, we're only assigning one FTE to employee A who worked 40 hours. Since everyone else worked under 40 hours, they're assigned 0.5. So super simple. However, the catch here is now our FTE total only comes to 2.5 instead of the 3.2 that it came to using the calculation method. However, let's say that you have several employees who work like 10 or 15 hours per week. Then this method might come in handy to give your FTE count, a little bump up, since you're assigning 0.5 as the FTE calculation rate instead of the lower increment that you would assign using the calculation method. So just do your due diligence and run both methods to see which one is the most advantageous for you to use so that you can maximize that loan forgiveness.
Right, and Amanda, here's a question that comes up pretty frequently, is a lot of employers consider full-time employees maybe at 35 hours a week or 30 hours a week, and usually that's for benefits. So if I have full-timers who all work 35 hours a week, do I count them as 1 or do I count them as 0.5?
Yeah, great question. So typically, to your point, Sherry, those are, discretionary decisions that can be made by the employer. So unfortunately, if we're following, these definitions, it specifically and explicitly states that the definition of a full-time equivalent employee is 40 hours. So anything underneath that 40 hours would have to, if you're using the simplified method, would have to be 0.5. So 40 and up equals 1, 40 and under, you're going to either do that calculation method or the simplified method, and it's going to be less than 1 FTE.
Okay, awesome. Awesome. All right. Myth number 5. The PPP funds can be used to prepay mortgage interest and utilities. We heard this from numerous CPAs and other people on the finance side, and unfortunately, it really isn't quite true. So this is from the actual forgiveness application, and it specifies on those eligible non-payroll costs. You see letter A, when it talks about mortgage interest, it specifically says not including any prepayment or payment of principal. So it's only the mortgage interest for that period. And then that last paragraph, eligible payroll costs must be paid during the covered period or incurred during the covered period and paid on or before the next regular billing date, even if the billing date is after the covered period. So first off, as far as prepaying is concerned, it doesn't say you can't prepay, but it does tell you when you have to, what costs are considered eligible, and those are not prepaid costs. So that last paragraph is super confusing, so I decided to pull together an example. So when this is again from the interim final rule, which I absolutely love that moniker, IFR, because I don't know how it can be interim and final at the same time, but that's what they've been giving us. When must non-payroll costs be incurred and or paid to be eligible for forgiveness? So the non-payroll costs have to either be paid during the covered period or incurred during the covered period and paid on or before the next billing period. So the example you see here, this National Grid, this is actually my bill. In case anybody is interested in paying it, feel free. But let's see, so this bill, as you see, is for billing period April 8th to the 11th of May, but the pay date is for June 4th. So if I take a look at the calendar, and again, our example of an employer who had their loans dispersed on May 27th, their covered period is the 27th of May through the 21st of July. So that bill, as you see highlighted in green, I'm going to pay on June 4th. So because I'm paying it during the covered period, even though it's for a period that it's covering utilities that were prior to this covered period, because I'm paying it during the covered period, those are eligible costs. Assuming that I'm going to get my next bill that's going to be due July 1st, July 2nd, and that July 2nd bill is going to cover sometime mid-May to mid-June. Again, that's during the covered period. And I'm also going to be able to include the bill that I should be receiving or paying by August 6th. Now that bill is going to cover parts of June and July. Even though I'm paying it outside of the covered period, because it is for utilities that were incurred during the covered period and I'm paying it by my next billing date, those will be eligible as well. All right. So myth number 6.
As long as an employee's salary is less than 100K annually, we do not have to apply the 15,385 cap. And unfortunately, no can do. So if we look at these instructions for the PPP Schedule A worksheet from the forgiveness application, you see highlighted on your screen that it says in the instructions, do not enter more than 15,385 in Table 1 or Table 2 for any individual employee. And if you remember back to the application form, Table 1 and Table 2 are where the cash compensation earned over the covered period or the alternative payroll covered period are entered in. So this means that even if an employee didn't make over 100K in 2019, but let's say that you're paying them hazard pay currently in order to incentivize them to come back to work, you cannot go over that 15,385 threshold during the covered period or the alternative payroll covered period, which is a nice segue into Sherry's next myth.
And I think a lot of that confusion also came from when you were initially applying for that PPP loan, they asked for your average month or 2 months of salary. or wages that you paid. So a lot of people understood that as a monthly wage. But when you take a look at monthly versus weekly, the numbers don't quite jive. So going into the second myth, employees can earn more than the 15,385 cap during the covered period if the company is giving out bonuses. Well, the latest interim final rule had a lot of questions and answers in here that caused some confusion, and we saw a couple of communications from different entities that assume that those bonuses were above and beyond, but they're not. So here it says our salary, wages, or commission payments for furloughed employees or bonuses or hazard pay during the covered period eligible for forgiveness. Now, in the CARES Act, when they define payroll costs, they talk about salary, wages, commissions, and then highlighted there you see similar compensation. So when this IFR came out, one of the in this question about the bonuses, as you see in the second paragraph or the second cutout, it says that the employees' total compensation, that the employees' hazard pay and bonuses are eligible for loan forgiveness because they constitute a supplement to salary or wages. So a lot of people sort of read just that far and said, oh, great, it's a supplement, so I can include it on top of my salary and wages. But the full sentence or the full paragraph reads, in thus a similar form of compensation. So all it's saying in here is that about bonuses, hazard pay, anything extra you're paying is actually considered similar compensation, which is part of those total payroll costs. Bottom line, you cannot put more than $15,385 for an 8-week period, regardless of how much money an employee has earned. All right, number 8.
Number 8, we can use the alternative payroll covered period for payroll costs since we pay our employees semi-monthly. So this is not permissible according to the regs. It clearly states in the forgiveness application that the alternative payroll cover period is for borrowers with a biweekly or more frequent payroll schedule. So I'm not quite sure why they didn't just keep it simple and say weekly or biweekly payroll schedule. But again, convoluted instructions for businesses throughout this pandemic has been the name of the game. So we'll just add it to the list. So let's look at an example here. So a semi-monthly payroll pays employees twice per month. So for example, on the 15th and then the final day of the month, and results in 24 pay dates per year, while a bi-weekly payroll pays employees every 2 weeks and results in 26 pay dates per year. So 24 semi-monthly, 26 bi-weekly. So if the purpose of the alternative payroll covered period is for administrative convenience, the bi-weekly cycle fits in nicely and is consistent with that measurement period, while the semi-monthly cycle is inconsistent with the measurement period. Also, remember that 15,385 cap, which ends up being 4/26 of 100,000 over the 8-week period, so 4 out of 26 payrolls. But employers who operate on a semi-monthly or monthly pay schedule actually pay 4/24 of an employee's annual compensation over the 8-week period, which would yield a higher rate at 16,667 when multiplied by 100,000. So you would be over that 15,385 cap if you paid semi-monthly, which wouldn't end up being an administrative convenience for you anyway. So you can see here that we're paying semi-monthly using the covered period, and our loan was funded on the 15th of April, which is also a payday. We pay on the 15th and the last day of the month, but since the pay periods don't line up with the paydays, there really is no administrative burden that you'd be easing by using this alternative payroll covered period. Looking at biweekly payroll schedules, you can see that the alternative payroll covered period allows for the biweekly pay periods to line up nicely with the paydays. So that's really where that administrative convenience comes into play.
Ooh, very well done, Amanda. All right, our last myth is the idle advance we received does not have to be repaid if I also received a PPP loan. Well, this was definitely a surprise to me, as I know it was to a lot of people, because if you go to the SBA's website and you look up idle advance for 10K, it specifically says, you see circled in red, this loan advance will not have to be repaid. Well, then you got to the application for forgiveness, and it asks you to both enter in that advance amount, and then it specifies on line 11 that it says, note, if applicable, SBA will deduct idle advance amounts from the forgiveness amount remitted to the lender. So where did that confusion come from? The idle loans, the emergency loans and advances are something that's an ongoing program through the SBA. Those loans are generally for emergencies such as hurricanes, tornadoes, floods. So the rules around those loans are specific to that particular program. The PPP loan is part of the CARES Act, and employers were able to apply for the idle loans while they were still applying for the PPP loans. And what wasn't clear really until this forgiveness application came out is that idle advance is just that. You've already gotten an advance from the SBA, so they're considering it an advance towards your PPP loan. So that will come off the top. So anybody who got a loan, it would have ranged anywhere from $1,000 up to $10,000. That will be coming off the top when you go for your forgiveness. Okie dokie, so we're gonna try for some live Q&A and take a look at some of the questions that have come in.
The first question we have is a really good one, and this has come up a couple of times. So with hourly employees, if their wage rate is the same, but their hours were reduced, is there a reduction? So if you look at the forgiveness application and you go through the exercise of doing the salary or wage reduction portion of, that's the section where the safe harbor is, you will see that you could either put in a salary, it specifically asks for salary, or an hourly rate. So if you go through and put in your hourly rate, let's just say the hourly rate was $20 pre-pandemic, and you're still paying the employee $20 an hour now, but they're just working far fewer hours. If you go through that exercise, you'll see that your forgiveness will not be impacted, and you may be eligible for that safe harbor. So they're looking at the hourly rate. They're not looking at those gross wages, which is good news.
All right, another really good question. What happens if you have technicians that are full-time employees, but depending on the week and workload, they could have 32 hours one week, 40 hours another week, and 45 hours another week, etc.? Are they considered full-time? So again, by definition, for everything else but the PPP loan, you might still consider them full-time. But as far as the PPP loan forgiveness, somebody like that who's a variable hour employee, and I'm going to assume that this is a non-exempt position, this is going to be where you're going to be taking those averages. So during the period that you're measuring, that 8-week period, the average amount of hours, and then you're going to divide that by 40 to determine, excuse me, what portion of that person's, you're going to divide by the number of weeks to get an average amount of hours, and then by 40 to get that percentage. So that individual may come up less than one under 40 hours. If during, let's say it's a business that during this time of year, maybe it's home heating oil, for example, and you're not really that busy, those hours will be less. The person will have worked less during that covered period than they normally would have. So it really is going to be dependent on the average amount of hours during the period, not necessarily classifying them as full-time or part-time. And one note on that, if you have salaried exempt employees, regardless of the number of hours they possibly work, you're just going to count them at 40 hours. You probably shouldn't be tracking hours for people who are exempt anyway, but if you are, for whatever reason, for billing purposes, they're still counted as 40 hours.
We're also getting some questions surrounding transportation costs, and this is currently a smoking hot question under the overarching umbrella of what are utility costs. And you know, as you've likely heard us say over and over again over the past several weeks and months of webinars, we are waiting with bated breath for clarification and guidance on this, and hopefully we'll get some. But in the meantime, if you're looking for some answers, I would recommend that you reach out to maybe your lending institution for guidance, since they're the ones that will be determining your forgiveness. But we are you know, keeping our fingers crossed that we get some further guidance on that, because it is very ambiguous at the moment.
Here's a really good question. With a seasonal hotel, I deferred my mortgage for 3 months, and it happens to be during the PPP period. Do I list the interest that is charged even though it's deferred? And that is a really, really good question. So a couple things are going to come into play here, one of which is this change now with the PPP Flexibility Act will give you, again, assuming that the president signs this into law, it's going to give you 24 weeks. So this might not be an issue. Let's say, for example, that you decide to stick with that 8-week period. The way the regs read, they have to be incurred and paid. So I don't think that those mortgage payments that have been deferred, I don't think the interest on that would be eligible, but I would definitely check with your lender. And again, we're hoping for a little bit more guidance on some of this as the new, excuse me, the new bill is dissected.
Does a special COVID bonus paid during the qualifying period qualify as payroll costs in the forgiveness calculation? And yes, we did get clarification on that from the interim final rule. They are considering bonus and hazard pay wages to be similar to payroll costs and payroll wages.
Could you apply for forgiveness prior to the end of the 24-week period? So from what I've read in the bill and some analysis of the bill, I believe the answer to that is yes. I don't know whether that's going to be advantageous or not, and I think that's definitely going to be that once we get some more guidance, I think we'll have a little more clearer answer on that. So again, stay tuned for MP's own Paul Corellis next week to dissect that for you.
I have both a monthly payroll as well as a biweekly payroll. Can I utilize the alternative payroll period for all payroll? And unfortunately, you can only use that for biweekly or more frequent payroll. So you would potentially be on 2 different cycles there. So you may want to consider just using the covered period across the board, but that's something that, you know, take a look at it, crunch some numbers and see what you come out with.
Right now, and that's going to depend on your payroll system that you're working on. So for those of you who MP clients who are using iSolve, the report will ask you for the forgiveness will ask you whether you're using the alternative period or the standard method of calculating your payroll costs. And that, like Amanda says, you'll have to pick one or the other. So it should be pulling. Unless you have that monthly payroll out of a different Fed ID, it should be pulling everything from both of those periods. Excuse me. Let's see. Regarding non-payroll costs incurred the month previous and are paid after the loan is dispersed, can these go towards the non-payroll cost PPP loan forgiveness? Yes. So again, as long as they are those eligible non-payroll costs, if you are paying them during the covered period, even if the expense was incurred before the covered period, you still will be able to count those as part of your non-payroll cost for forgiveness.
I just want to clarify, because I see a question in here. I've just received notification from a CPA that there are some extensions. Is all of this information you're covering today and presenting changing? So the information we presented over the period of the 9 myths, that is information that is currently in effect. We haven't gotten official word that this information will be changing yet. So that is under the assumption that we're, things are not changing. However, stay tuned. Again, as Sherry mentioned, next week, the most interesting man in HR, Paul Corellis, will be going through, this extension that is sitting on the president's desk right now, and hopefully will be signed. But stay tuned for more.
Right, and that's going to be regardless of the number of weeks, whether it's 8 weeks or 24 weeks, the methods that we spoke about in those myths and those examples are still going to apply. It's just going to apply over a longer period of time.
Exactly.
All right. Let's see. If the PPP Flexibility Act is signed into law, does the June 30th FTE requirement change to 12/31/2020? I do believe. So the only thing we're not quite certain on, because in the bill, it basically says is that prior to the bill being signed, anybody who got their loan prior to the bill being signed, which let's assume it's going to be today, then anybody prior to that could choose the 8-week period. If you choose the 8-week period, I'm not certain whether that 12/31 date is going to apply to bring your FTEs up. But after the date of the bill is applied, the bill is signed, yes, you will have until December 31st. So let's say you're a restaurant right now and you're only open to, that outdoor seating is very limited, and you're not bringing all of your employees back yet, but with hopes by the end of the summer, into the fall, we'll be able to do that. So you will have until December 31st to bring those FTE counts back up.
For the FTE, is it based on scheduled hours or actual worked hours over the time frame? Great question. It's based upon hours paid.
Okay, so there are actually 9 paid periods that the loan covers regardless of the option chosen, and not 8. That's very possible. It's going to depend on when your when your disbursement was and when your paid periods fall. But yes, oftentimes it's going to be that 9 paid periods if you're on a weekly basis.
Let's see, are temporary seasonal employees included in payroll costs and FTE count? So yes, all employees paid during the period of time selected are included in payroll costs, as well as to determine head count for FTE count for eligibility purposes.
All right, and this is kind of along the same lines. If we hire more employees due to internships than we had when the loan originated, will their payroll be covered, or does it revert to our original headcount and costs? No, they will be covered as long as they're being paid or their wages were incurred during your covered period. Those costs will be included. You'll be able to use those funds for forgiveness for those costs as well.
If the extension does get approved for a 60-40 split, does that mean we can no longer spend more than 60% on payroll costs? So no, so you can spend, assuming that, what's in place continues to be in place. But right now, they're saying that you can spend more than 75% of your loan on payroll costs. You just can't spend less than 75% of the loan on payroll costs. So under the assumption that that's still going to ring true under this extension, you would be able to spend more than 60% on payroll costs with that extension in place.
Right. And from what I read, that change to the 60-40, 60% payroll costs at least, and 40% for non-payroll costs is with the extension to 24 weeks. Some employers still may not be able to bring all of their employees back right away and use those wages, but they will be continuing to incur additional months of non-payroll costs, regardless of how many employees they have on. So that's why the amount has changed. But as Amanda said, the 60% is the minimum amount, or currently the 75% is the minimum amount for payroll. You can always spend more on payroll. All right. Do you have any idea how or whether the changes in the bill that will be signed today will apply to loans already received? We're in the middle of our 8-week period and obviously signed a note based on a 2-year maturity, etc. Again, the employers that are the businesses that have gotten their loan prior to the bill being signed will be able to choose whether they want to use that 8-week period or the 24-week period. As far as the loan maturity is concerned, that will be increasing from 2 years to 5 years. I don't think it doesn't appear to matter whether you got the loan prior to the bill being signed or not. But again, that's subject to change depending on what other additional interim final rules that the SBA puts out.
Can I issue an additional hazard pay bonus as long as it doesn't exceed $15,385? Yes, you can.
That was easy.
That was the easiest question all
love
day.
it.
Yeah.
I know, exactly. All right, so here's this, and I know we've talked about this, but I think this is a very, again, just a helpful point to reiterate. It says our biweekly payroll is 75 hours or 37.5 hours per week. Is that 0.5 or is that 1? It's going to depend on how you want to calculate it. So technically, it's 0.5 unless you decide to use the calculation method. So if you're using that alternative method, it would be a 0.5 because it's still under 40 hours. But if you are going to be using the calculation method, can't do the math that quickly in my head, but it's going to be somewhere around 0.9.
In the PPP Flexibility Act, are repayments still going to begin 6 months from loan disbursement date, or will that be extended? Since safe harbor date will be extended to 12/31/20, seems to me loan repayments would need to be some date after that. So we do believe that the deferral will be extended. We've just heard a couple of different theories on this. So once we get the official word, we're going to dissect that and give you that exact information. But yes, we do believe that will be extended.
All right, what if you included part-time employees as a full FTE on your application? Will this hurt you now? So, and that's a great question. So when you initially applied for the loan, it did ask for your total number of FTEs at the time. Or total number of employees. And then when you look at the forgiveness application, it will ask you again what number you gave when you put the application in, and then what number you gave, you have on hand when you go to apply for forgiveness. Those total numbers really don't have any bearing on the forgiveness. I'm not sure why they're asking for the information, but when it comes to the forgiveness, it is definitely going to be looking at the period that you looked at before and said, okay, I've got, based on the regulations, I came up with 22 FTEs, and then during your covered period, you're coming up with 22 FTEs, even if prior to that on the application you put down that you had 53 employees, it doesn't matter. If during your period that you are calculating, which was from February 15th, 2019 to June 30th, 2019, or January 1, 2020 to February 29th, 2020, you use those 2 periods to determine your FTE count, right? And that's for the forgiveness piece. And then, so that's the number we're going to be looking at, or they're going to be looking at for forgiveness, not that initial number that you put on your application.
When do I have to file my forgiveness paperwork? So you're going to want to hold off for the moment until we get some more information, but you're going to turn that in after your whatever 8-week period, 24-week period, whenever that period is over. And because remember, you can the payments that you distribute after the covered period or the alternative payroll cover period can be covered if they were incurred during that 8-week or 24-week window. So you're going to want to wait until after everything's paid out to turn in that forgiveness application to maximize your forgiveness.
Right. And I know I reading through the bill that was just passed or is in the process of being signed, it was looking at when all of those could be, when loans could be approved, the forgiveness approved and processed and all of that was very, very unclear. So we're hoping to get some more clarification on that. Let's see. Can the non-payroll forgivable portion of the loan be used to pay interest on company vehicle loans? So that is still a little bit unclear. So it does say interest on on mortgage or personal property. And I'm not certain the general, what we've heard from some of the law firms that we follow is that yes, it is, but I haven't seen anything, a hard and fast rule on that or any kind of definition. For some reason, they really seem to be avoiding these questions that are coming up regarding the non-payroll costs. There's definitely a lot of clarification that is still needed, and they still haven't put that out yet. So I would definitely check back with your lender to be certain on that.
If the loan was funded on May 12th, can you use PPP funds to pay rent for May? So if you're paying May's rent within your covered period, then yes. So, and also keep in mind that if you're paying that in June, then it's paid during that covered period. So that would be permissible.
Right. And we're basing all of this really based on the language that's in there now, because so it does appear that it's when it's paid, it's not looking for you to prorate the rent or the or your utility costs for partial months. Now that could change with future guidance, but as it stands right now and as it's written right now, it does appear that as long as it's paid during the covered period, it would be counted as non-payroll costs. Do I use the FTE calc for figuring the basis for loss of employees, i.e. when I do the comparison to the pre-COVID period? When I applied, they didn't have the same definition for full-time employees. And that's a great question. So when you first applied, again, you weren't giving that FTE count. So don't worry about those counts. It's really going to be, once you go to apply for forgiveness, you're going to look at those FTE counts during either of those two periods prior to the pandemic, and then your current ones to make sure that you have maintained your head count. So don't worry about what was on the initial application. That number is really, we didn't know then what full-time was. A lot of people counted full-time based on either what you called full-time, or a lot of us were really falling back on the ACA definition of full-time.
How do you calculate for someone who resigns during the covered period? So as we've now know and heard, the good news is that there are 4 different kind of exceptions for reduction in FTE during the covered period. So if someone voluntarily resigns, or if you have to terminate someone for cause, those would not impact your forgiveness, which is great news. When you go through the application, you're going to and look at table 1 and 2, you're going to see a section where on that table where, and forgive me, I don't know the exact language off the top of my head, but there's going to be a spot where you can put in the number of folks who fall under one of those exceptions. So you would put your how many people resigned or how many people you had to terminate for cause in that box, and then it would be reduced, or you would add that onto your current payroll and your current employee count, and it would account for those. So look at box 1 and 2, and that's where you would put that information in.
And even better news, and again, I'm not going to go into great detail because it has just come out. We really do need to kind of dissect this. But for those businesses that are going to be impacted much longer than these reopening phases allow. So, for example, anybody to do with events. So whether you're a venue, whether you're a catering service, or florists, anything where those events being canceled are going to impact your business, not just during that closed period in the state, but even once businesses reopen, those are going to come back much later. So the good news is that in the flexibility bill that has just passed, there are some provisions in that as well. So Paul will be going into more detail with that next week, but that was really, really good news, because that was getting very worrisome for a lot, because if your business isn't coming back full throttle, even by the end of the year, how are you going to get those FTEs back? So there's definitely some provisions in there that I think you'll be very pleased with. All right, I think we have maybe time for one more question. You want to grab one more, Amanda, and then we'll turn it back over to Jackie.
Sure, yeah. So question here, do I have to keep the same number of employees? So part-time must stay part-time. And no, if you're booming right now and you have part-time folks that are able to work full-time hours, more power to you. Do it. So you don't have to keep your part-time folks as part-time. They can work more hours. You know, on the flip side, if you had people working full-time hours and you're bumping them down to part-time, you may want to consider bringing them back up. But you know, the opposite can absolutely be done.
All right, and with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Jackie to take us home.
All
Oh, wait,
right.
I'm sorry. Wait, I'm sorry, Jackie. I forgot our loan PPP loan forgiveness resources. Sorry about that, Jackie. So
No
there's
problem.
links here. Like Jackie mentioned at the beginning, you'll be getting a copy of the slides and a link to the recording. So the PPP loan application link is here. The requirements for the loan forgiveness, this is the interim final rule that came out recently. The Paycheck Protection Flexibility Act, if you are like us and sort of geek out over reading bills, there's a link for you there. And then always MassPay's COVID-19 resource page will keep you up to date. And now I'll turn it back to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much to Sherry and Amanda both for presenting today. We want to take a minute to thank all of you for attending this webinar and any other webinars that you've attended in the past. We appreciate it. I want to quickly remind everyone that a link to the recording will be sent out within the next couple of hours, including the slide deck. A lot of you were asking about that. As Sherry said, do keep a lookout for the announcement for next week's webinar tomorrow morning, which will be on the PPP Flexibility Act. If you have any further questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at marketing@masspay.net. We hope you have a great day and stay healthy. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
everybody.